The truth about the Great Chinese Famine, a tragedy unveiled, will shock you. The years between 1959 and 1961 mark one of the darkest periods in modern Chinese history, the Great Chinese Famine. Tens of millions perished during this catastrophe, which was caused not solely by environmental factors, but predominantly by a combination of government policies, poor planning, and the silencing of dissent. This video explores the causes, impact, and lessons of the famine, shedding light on a tragedy that remains a cautionary tale for humanity. After the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the nation underwent sweeping reforms under Mao Zedong's communist leadership. By the late 1950s, Mao envisioned a bold plan to leapfrog China into a leading global power. This vision culminated in the Great Leap Forward, an ambitious campaign to industrialize China and establish a collectivized utopian society. At its core, the Great Leap Forward sought to rapidly modernize China's economy, with a dual emphasis on agricultural collectivization and industrial productivity. Communes replaced traditional farming practices, dismantling centuries-old systems that had sustained Chinese agriculture. Meanwhile, rural labor forces were diverted into industrial projects such as backyard steel production, leaving the agricultural sector severely crippled. Fueled by propaganda and ideological fervor, local officials exaggerated grain yields to exceed state quotas. This not only misrepresented available resources but also resulted in massive amounts of grain being exported to maintain China's international image while its people starved. The devastating famine was not the product of one failure, but rather a series of systemic missteps and environmental troubles that aggravated an already dire situation. One of the most significant failures was the collectivization of farming. Traditional family farms were replaced by large-scale communes where private ownership was abolished. Farmers were required to pool their resources, yet many lacked the motivation to work efficiently. At the same time, the government imposed steep grain quotas. Local officials, caught in the crossfire of their own fears and the expectations of the central government, falsified production numbers to secure favor with leadership. These exaggerated reports, in turn, led to unrealistic quotas being set for the following year. The result? Local populations were left with little or no grain for themselves. Simultaneously, the government pushed labor into industrialization, with millions mobilized to participate in small-scale steel production in backyard furnaces. Farmers left their fields to fuel this drive, causing agricultural productivity to plummet. Piled on top of these mismanaged policies were bouts of natural disasters, including floods and droughts, which worsened the situation while offering the government a scapegoat for policy failure. The most remarkable and tragic element of this famine is the fact that it was largely man-made. Grain warehouses were often full, but due to misinformation and political pressure, the food could not or would not be redistributed. Desperate acts of survival, including stealing from reserves or hunting for inedible roots, were punishable by death, leaving starving populations with no viable options. The scope of human suffering during the Great Chinese Famine is unparalleled. Estimates suggest anywhere from 15 to 45 million people perished, with the true numbers likely on the higher end of the spectrum. Entire families were decimated, leaving rural villages empty and broken. Countless parents were forced to make the impossible decision to prioritize one child's survival over another's. As famine gripped the countryside, scenes of desperation became horrifyingly common. People foraged for bark, leaves, and even dirt in a last-ditch effort to stave off hunger. Villagers were also driven to acts of cannibalism, consuming the deceased or, in even more desperate cases, trading children with neighbors to avoid eating their own. Many who survived did so at the cost of their physical and emotional health. Malnutrition led to physical deformities, weakened immune systems, and stunted growth in children. Mental trauma lingered long after the famine ended, leaving scars on survivors that shaped their perspectives on trust, authority, and survival. Beyond the individual level, the famine disrupted cultural and social norms. Weddings, festivals, and communal events became rare as survival took precedence. Communities that once thrived on cooperation and shared values were dissolved by hunger and desperation. The political climate during the Great Chinese Famine was marked by suppression and denial. The government led by Mao Zedong refused to accept the extent of the disaster. Fear dominated the political environment, with local officials under immense pressure to meet unrealistic quotas and avoid disfavor. Propaganda played a significant role in suppressing the truth. The state-controlled media painted the Great Leap Forward as a resounding success, showing fertile harvests and happy workers. Meanwhile, the suffering of rural populations remained hidden from both domestic urban centers and the international community. Dissent was effectively silenced during this time. Those who sought to speak out about the famine or challenge Mao's policies faced severe consequences. Public denunciations, imprisonment, or executions were common. Outside of China, the famine received sparse attention. The Cold War climate made information difficult to verify, and China's global allies, such as the Soviet Union, showed little willingness to interfere or provide aid. The scale of the famine was not fully uncovered until years later, when survivors began sharing their stories and researchers accessed declassified documents. The Great Chinese Famine offers several critical lessons about governance, ideology, and human survival. First, it highlights the dangers of prioritizing ideological goals over practical needs. The Great Leap Forward was driven by a lofty vision, but it ignored the realities of agricultural production and human behavior. Political leaders failed to balance revolutionary goals with the pragmatic necessities of feeding their population. Second, it underscores the importance of accountability in leadership. During the famine, decision-makers refrained from acknowledging failure or making necessary policy adjustments due to fear, pride, and rigid adherence to ideology. Governance demands flexibility and the ability to adapt approaches when faced with evidence of harm. Transparency and open communication also emerge as essential lessons from this tragedy. Falsified data and a lack of truthful reporting led to flawed decisions by the highest levels of government. Without accurate information, it becomes impossible to implement effective solutions, especially during crises. For decades following the famine, the Chinese government remained largely silent on the issue. Official narratives downplayed the catastrophe, framing it as a natural disaster rather than a man-made event. When Mao Zedong passed away in 1976, and the era of reform and opening up began under Deng Xiaoping, there was more space for historians and journalists to investigate these events. However, public discussion on the famine has remained a sensitive subject in China. It was largely through the work of independent researchers, such as historian Frank Decoter, that the true scale of the famine began to emerge. Survivor testimonies, declassified government records, and satellite imagery of abandoned villages have all contributed to reconstructing the events. Yet even today, rewriting history to downplay the famine remains a controversial and ongoing process in China. The Great Chinese Famine shares parallels with other man-made famines in world history, such as the Soviet Union's Holodomor in the 1930s. Both were driven by oppressive policies, misinformation, and an inability to admit failure within rigid authoritarian regimes. These events demonstrate the universal risks of centralized power suppressing dissent while ignoring practical realities. On a broader scale, the famine also highlights the importance of vigilance in monitoring governments worldwide. When ideology takes precedence over humanity, the loss of life and potential for suffering can be catastrophic. The Great Chinese Famine left an indelible mark on China and its people. Survivor testimony reveals a population deeply scarred by hunger, mistrust, and trauma. It also influenced future Chinese policies, such as limiting overambitious government-led campaigns and focusing on pragmatic economic reforms. For today's world, this tragedy stands as a stark reminder of what can happen when governance fails to prioritize transparency, open dialogue, and the well-being of its people. As we grapple with global crises of our own time, understanding the causes and consequences of events like the Great Famine becomes ever more important. The Great Chinese Famine is a story of immense pain, but it is also a warning. It compels us to hold leaders accountable, demand honesty in decision-making, and place humanity at the heart of progress. By remembering these hard lessons, we honor the lives lost and work to build a better future.